The black sedan idled at the curb like a lifeline, and Ethan Cole didn't think twice. Rain hammered his shoulders as he yanked open the door and collapsed into the back seat, gasping with relief. "Thank God you waited," he breathed, dragging a hand through his soaked hair. "I thought the app canceled on me." The driver said nothing. Ethan barely noticed. His interview started in 20 minutes. His daughter's daycare bill was 3 weeks overdue, and this job at Hard Industries was the only thing standing between him and complete financial collapse. So he talked. He talked about his terrible luck, about Mia's upcoming birthday, about the pressure crushing his chest every single morning. He talked all the way downtown, pouring his desperation into the silence. Only when the car stopped did he glance up and see her face in the rearview mirror. Sharp. Composed. Absolutely not his rideshare driver. Vivian Hart, CEO of the company he was about to walk into, stared back at him with one eyebrow raised and the faintest ghost of a smile. "We've arrived," she said quietly. "If you want to see how a single mistake can change everything, stay with me until the end, and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels." Ethan sat frozen in the back seat, his brain struggling to catch up with reality. The woman behind the wheel wasn't moving. She simply watched him in the mirror, her expression unreadable, while rain drummed against the roof of the car like a countdown clock. His voice came out strangled. "I'm so sorry. I thought you were my Uber." "I gathered that," Vivian said, her tone dry but not unkind. She shifted in her seat, finally turning to look at him directly. Her eyes were gray, sharp as glass, and they took in everything about him in a single sweep. The cheap suit still dripping rainwater onto her leather interior, the scuffed shoes, the panic written all over his face. "You have an interview this morning." It wasn't a question. "Yes." Ethan's throat felt like sandpaper. "At Hard Industries, in..." He checked his phone with shaking hands. 17 minutes. Vivian's lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment he was certain she was going to tell him to get out, to find his own way, that he'd already blown whatever slim chance he'd had. Instead, she reached for the gear shift. "Then we should go," she said simply, and pulled back into traffic. Ethan couldn't speak. His mind raced through everything he'd just said during the ride, every personal detail he'd spilled into what he'd thought was the anonymous safety of a hired car. He'd mentioned Mia's struggles with reading, the eviction notice he'd barely managed to fight off, the way he sometimes bought her birthday presents months in advance because he was never sure there'd be money when the actual day came. He'd essentially laid his entire life bare in front of the woman who held his future in her hands. The silence in the car now felt suffocating. Ethan stared at the back of Vivian's head, at the precise way her dark hair was pulled into a low knot, at the expensive cut of her jacket. Everything about her screamed control, power, the kind of wealth and authority that existed in a completely different universe from his own. "I really am sorry," he tried again. "I should have checked before I got in. I just saw a black car and assumed..." "That it was yours," Vivian finished. "Yes, I understand how rideshare works, Mr. Cole." The use of his name sent a fresh jolt of anxiety through him. Of course she knew who he was. She'd probably reviewed his application herself, seen his resume with its gaps and lateral moves, the clear evidence of someone trying to hold together a career while raising a child alone. He'd just spent 15 minutes proving every doubt she might have had about him. The Hard Industries tower rose ahead of them, all gleaming glass and steel, a monument to the kind of success Ethan had only ever glimpsed from a distance. Vivian guided the car into an underground parking garage, past security barriers that lifted automatically at her approach, into a space marked with her name. She turned off the engine. The sudden silence felt enormous. "Mr. Cole," she said, still facing forward, "in approximately 12 minutes, you're going to walk into a boardroom on the 42nd floor. There will be 4 people waiting for you: myself, our head of operations, our CFO, and our HR director." Now she turned, meeting his eyes with an intensity that made him forget to breathe. "What happened in this car stays in this car. Do you understand?" Ethan nodded, not trusting his voice. "The interview process is merit-based. Your application stood out because of your operational experience and your problem-solving approach, not because you accidentally hijacked my morning commute." Her expression softened almost imperceptibly. "But I will tell you this once. Being a parent who shows up, who fights for their child, who doesn't give up when things get hard. That's not a weakness. Don't treat it like one. Before Ethan could respond, she was out of the car, her heels clicking sharply against the concrete as she strode toward the elevator bank. She didn't look back, didn't wait for him. The message was clear. What happened next was entirely up to him. Ethan sat in the empty car for 10 more seconds, his heart hammering against his ribs. Then he grabbed his bag, checked his reflection in the window, tried to smooth down his wet hair and straighten his tie, and followed her inside. The 42nd floor was nothing like Ethan had imagined. He'd expected corporate sterility, but instead found warm wood paneling, soft lighting, and windows that offered a sweeping view of Boston Harbor. A receptionist directed him to a small waiting area where he tried to calm his breathing and review his notes one last time. His phone buzzed. A text from Mia's daycare director. Just confirming pickup time today. Also wanted to remind you about the fall festival fee due by Friday. Another bill. Another deadline. Ethan closed his eyes and let himself imagine, just for a moment, what it would feel like to not be drowning. To say yes when Mia asked for the slightly more expensive sneakers. To fix the leak in their apartment ceiling himself instead of waiting months for their landlord to ignore it. Mr. Cole? A woman in a crisp pantsuit stood before him, tablet in hand. We're ready for you. The boardroom was exactly as intimidating as he'd feared. A massive table, high-backed leather chairs, and 4 people who represented more combined wealth and influence than everyone Ethan had ever known in his entire life. Vivian sat at the head of the table, her expression completely neutral. If he hadn't spent the last 20 minutes in her car, he would never have guessed they'd already met. Please, sit, said a man in his 50s with silver hair and an easy smile. I'm Richard Chen, head of operations. This is Patricia Okonkwo, our CFO, and James Thornton from HR. Ethan shook each of their hands, hyper-aware of his still damp sleeves, and took the seat across from Vivian. She didn't look at him directly, but he could feel her presence like a weight in the room. Let's start simple, Richard said, leaning back in his chair. Walk us through your current role and what drew you to Hart Industries. Ethan had rehearsed this answer 100 times, but now, sitting across from Vivian Hart herself, his prepared speech felt hollow. So he made a choice. He decided to tell the truth. I work in operations management for a mid-sized logistics company, he began. I've been there for 4 years, and I'm good at what I do. I can see inefficiencies that other people miss, and I'm not afraid to propose solutions that might be unpopular if they're the right call. He paused, meeting Richard's eyes. But the company I work for now isn't interested in innovation. They want to maintain the status quo, even when it's costing them money and opportunities. I've watched them ignore problems I could fix, and it's been frustrating. And you think Hart Industries would be different? Patricia asked, her tone skeptical but not dismissive. I know you would be, Ethan said. I followed your expansion over the last 3 years. The way you restructured your supply chain partnerships, the investment in predictive analytics, the decision to vertically integrate your distribution network, those aren't the moves of a company that's comfortable standing still. He saw Vivian's fingers still on the tablet in front of her, just for a second. You've done your homework, Richard acknowledged, but research is different from execution. Can you give us an example of a time when you identified a problem and implemented a solution that had measurable impact? This was the question Ethan had been waiting for. He pulled out his laptop and opened a presentation he'd built specifically for this interview. 2 years ago, our shipping delays were up 30% year over year. Management blamed it on driver shortages and fuel costs, but when I analyzed the data, I found something else. He turned the screen so they could see the graphs he'd created. The delays weren't random. They clustered around specific routes and specific times. When I dug deeper, I realized our routing software was using outdated traffic pattern data. It was sending drivers into predictable bottlenecks. So you updated the software? James asked. I couldn't. We didn't own it, and the vendor's update cycle was 18 months out. Ethan clicked to the next slide. So I built a workaround. I created a simple overlay using publicly available traffic, AP, is that our dispatchers could check before confirming routes. It took me 3 weeks working nights and weekends, but once we implemented it, delays dropped by 42% in the first quarter. Did you receive recognition for this? Patricia asked. Ethan smiled ruefully. My manager took credit for it in his performance review. But the system's still running, and it's still working. That matters more to me than recognition. Vivian spoke for the first time since the interview began. Why? Her single word cut through the room. Ethan turned to face her and found those gray eyes locked on him with an intensity that felt like a physical force. Because the work matters, he said simply. Because when that system works, drivers get home to their families on time. Because efficiency isn't just about profit margins. It's about respecting people's time and labor and lives. He held her gaze. And because if I'm going to spend 40, 50, 60 hours a week doing something, it should be something that makes a difference. The silence that followed felt different from before. Ethan couldn't read the expressions around the table, but he knew he'd said something that landed. Richard was the first to speak again. Tell me about your experience with budget management. The interview continued for another 40 minutes. They asked about conflict resolution, about his experience with different project management methodologies, about how he handled competing priorities and impossible deadlines. Ethan answered each question honestly, drawing from real experiences rather than textbook responses. And through it all, Vivian watched him. She asked fewer questions than the others, but when she did speak, her questions cut straight to the heart of what mattered. She didn't care about his familiarity with specific software platforms. She wanted to know how he made decisions under pressure, how he balanced competing values, what he did when he didn't have enough information to be certain. Finally, Richard closed his folder. I think we have what we need. Do you have any questions for us? Ethan had prepared 5 questions. He asked only one. If I'm fortunate enough to be offered this position, what would success look like in the first 90 days? Patricia smiled. That's a good question. Richard? We're restructuring our East Coast distribution network, Richard explained. It's a massive undertaking. We're talking about optimizing 17 facilities, renegotiating contracts with 43 vendors, and implementing new inventory management systems across the board. The person we hire for this role will be leading the operations analysis portion of that project. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. This was exactly the kind of challenge he'd been craving. What's the timeline? Aggressive, Vivian said. We need the analysis complete and recommendations ready for board review by January 15th. That's less than 3 months, Ethan said. Yes. Vivian's expression didn't change. Is that a problem? Ethan thought about the spreadsheet he kept on his phone, the one where he tracked every dollar, every bill, every careful calculation that kept him and Mia afloat. He thought about the leak in their ceiling and the daycare fees and the constant grinding anxiety of never having enough margin for error. He thought about what it would mean to fail at this, to go back to his current job with nothing changed, nothing better. Then he thought about what it would mean to succeed. No, he said, it's an opportunity. They thanked him for his time, shook his hand again, told him HR would be in touch within a week, the same things they probably told every candidate. Ethan rode the elevator down alone, watching the floor numbers drop, trying to process what had just happened. He'd either completely nailed the interview or crashed spectacularly, and he honestly couldn't tell which. The rain had stopped by the time he emerged onto the street. Boston stretched out around him, gleaming and wet, full of people rushing toward their own urgent destinations. Ethan checked his phone and realized he had just enough time to grab a coffee before heading to work for the second half of his shift, his current job. His safe, predictable, soul-crushing job that paid just enough to keep the wolves from the door. He was halfway to the subway when his phone rang. Unknown number. Hello? Mr. Cole, this is James Thornton from Hard Industries. Ethan's heart stopped. Yes, hi, hello. I'll be brief. The team was impressed with your interview this morning. We'd like to offer you the position of Senior Operations Analyst starting Monday, November 1st. The formal offer letter will be in your email within the hour, but I wanted to reach out personally. The world seemed to tilt. Ethan found himself leaning against a building, his hand pressed to his chest. Yes. Thank you. I accept. James laughed. You might want to review the compensation package before you commit. Right, yes, of course. Ethan was grinning like an idiot, not caring who saw. But yes, I'm accepting. Thank you so much. After they hung up, Ethan stood on the sidewalk for a full minute, just breathing. Then he called the one person who would understand what this meant. "Daddy!" Mia's voice burst through the phone, bright and perfect. "Did you get the job?" "How did you know I was calling about the job?" "Because you always call me when something big happens. Ms. Rodriguez said I could answer even though it's quiet time." Ethan closed his eyes, overwhelmed by love for this fierce, brilliant 6-year-old who had grown up too fast because she'd had to. "Yeah, baby, I got the job." Her shriek of joy nearly deafened him. "Does this mean we can get the good mac and cheese? The one with the real cheese?" "Yeah," Ethan said, his voice rough. "We can get the good mac and cheese." The next 2 weeks blurred together in a chaos of transitions. Ethan gave notice at his old job, endured his manager's passive-aggressive disappointment, and spent his evenings reviewing everything he could find about Hart Industries' current operations. The offer package had been better than he dared to hope. Not wealthy by any means, but enough. Enough to breathe. Enough to plan more than a month ahead. Enough to take Mia out for her birthday dinner somewhere nicer than the pizza place with the broken air conditioning. His first day arrived cold and bright. Ethan dressed carefully in one of the 2 good suits he owned, made Mia her favorite breakfast, and walked her to school before heading downtown. The Hart Industries building looked different now that he belonged here. The security guard checked his new ID badge and waved him through to the elevators. A woman from HR met him in the lobby and guided him through orientation, building access, benefits enrollment, IT setup, the overwhelming cascade of information that came with any new job. "Mr. Chen will meet you in conference room C at 10, she told him. "That's where your project team gathers for daily stand-ups." The project team turned out to be 8 people, most of them older than Ethan, all of them with impressive credentials and the kind of easy confidence that came from years of success. Richard Chen introduced him quickly, and Ethan caught the appraising looks, the subtle skepticism. The new guy. The unknown quantity. He'd have to prove himself all over again. "All right, let's dive in," Richard said, pulling up a presentation on the large monitor. "Ethan, I'll catch you up to speed as we go. We're currently in the analysis phase of the distribution network restructuring. Each person here owns a different component: vendor relationships, facility optimization, inventory systems, transportation logistics. You get the idea." "What's my component?" Ethan asked. "Data integration and analysis. You'll be pulling information from all the other work streams and looking for patterns, inefficiencies, and opportunities. Think of yourself as the person who sees the whole picture while everyone else is focused on their individual pieces." It was perfect. It was exactly what Ethan was good at. The meeting continued for 90 minutes, and Ethan filled an entire notebook with information, questions, and ideas that were already forming. These people were smart, no question, but he could already see gaps in their approach. Places where they were working in silos instead of collaborating. Data sets that weren't being cross-referenced the way they should be. After the meeting, a woman named Sharon, who handled vendor relationships, approached him. "You look overwhelmed." "Is it that obvious?" Ethan asked. She smiled. "First day in a new job is always drinking from a fire hose, but you'll catch on fast. Richard doesn't hire people who can't handle the pace." She hesitated. "Just so you know, this project is Ms. Hart's personal priority. She checks in on our progress at least twice a week. She has high standards, and she doesn't accept excuses." "Good to know, no," Ethan said, keeping his expression neutral. What Sharon didn't know, what nobody except Vivian herself knew, was that he'd already been tested by those high standards. In the back seat of a car, soaking wet and terrified, spilling his whole life story to a woman who could have dismissed him in an instant. She hadn't. That had to mean something. So, Ethan didn't see Vivian for the first 3 days. He was too buried in data, too focused on learning the systems and understanding the scope of the project. He worked late each night, arranged for Mia's after-school care, and fell into bed exhausted but energized in a way he hadn't felt in years. On Thursday afternoon, Richard stopped by his desk. "Ms. Hart wants a preliminary analysis of the transportation logistics data by tomorrow morning. Think you can handle that?" Ethan looked at the clock. It was already 4:30. "What level of detail?" "High level. She wants to know if you see any red flags or major opportunities. 2 pages maximum." "I'll have it ready." Richard clapped him on the shoulder. "I told her you would." After Richard left, Ethan pulled up every transportation file he'd been given access to. Shipping routes, fuel costs, delivery times, vehicle maintenance records, driver schedules. Thousands of rows of data that would take a normal person weeks to analyze properly. Ethan had always been good with patterns. It was like his brain was wired to see connections that others missed, to spot the anomaly in the spreadsheet, the inconsistency in the timeline, the gap in the logic. By 8 o'clock, he had it. The problem wasn't where anyone had been looking. He wrote his analysis carefully, backing up every claim with data, providing 3 specific recommendations with projected cost savings for each. Then he sent it to Richard and copied Vivian because the assignment had come from her. Ethan made it home by 9, paid the babysitter, and found Mia already asleep with a book on her chest. He carefully removed it, tucked her in properly, and allowed himself to feel just for a moment the strange new sensation of hope. The next morning there was an email waiting for him. Mr. Cole, your analysis was thorough and insightful. I'd like to discuss your 3rd recommendation in person. My office, 10 a.m. V. Hart Sharon saw him reading it and whistled low. Summoned to the executive floor already? You work fast. Is that bad? Ethan asked. Depends on whether she liked what you sent her. Sharon grinned. Good luck. At exactly 10 o'clock, Ethan stepped off the elevator onto the executive floor. It was quieter here, the carpet thicker, the art on the walls original rather than prints. Vivian's assistant, a man in his 30s with perfect posture and an iPad, greeted him with professional courtesy. She's expecting you. Go right in. Vivian's office was corner-positioned with floor-to-ceiling windows offering views of both the harbor and the financial district. The furniture was modern and minimal, the surfaces clear except for a single laptop and a slim vase holding fresh flowers. Vivian herself stood by the window, looking out at the city. She wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Ethan's monthly rent, and her hair was loose today, falling just past her shoulders. She turned when he entered. Close the door, please. Ethan did. His heart was racing again, that same feeling from the car, from the interview. The sense that he was in the presence of someone extraordinary. Your 3rd recommendation, Vivian said, gesturing to one of the chairs across from her desk. You suggested we terminate our contract with Northeastern Logistics and bring the routes in-house. Yes. Ethan sat, pulling out his tablet. The data shows they're consistently underperforming on delivery times and their rates are 15% higher than the market average. If we hired our own drivers and purchased or leased our own vehicles, we'd break even within 18 months and save approximately $2.3 million annually after that. Northeastern Logistics has been our partner for 8 years, Vivian said. They're reliable, established, and their CEO is a personal friend of our board chairman. Ethan's stomach dropped. He'd walked straight into corporate politics without realizing it. I didn't know that. I know you didn't. Vivian moved to her desk, pulling up something on her laptop. Which is why your recommendation is valuable. You looked at the data without bias, without history, without relationships clouding your judgment. She turned the screen toward him. I ran my own analysis last night after reading your report. Your numbers are conservative. I think the savings would be closer to $3 million annually. Ethan blinked. So you're going to do it? I'm going to present it to the board with your analysis as supporting evidence. They won't like it, but they'll approve it because the numbers don't lie. She studied him with that unsettling intensity. You've been here less than a week, and you've already identified a multi-million-dollar opportunity. That's either remarkable instinct or remarkable luck. It's neither, Ethan said. It's just data analysis. Anyone could have seen it. But they didn't. You did. Vivian closed the laptop. I want you to know that I don't give praise lightly, Mr. Cole, but you're doing excellent work, and I wanted to tell you that directly. The compliment landed with unexpected weight. Ethan felt himself flush, suddenly aware of how close they were, how the morning light caught the gray of her eyes and turned them almost silver. Thank you, he managed. That means a lot. Vivian's expression softened almost imperceptibly. For just a second, she looked like she might say something else, something that wasn't about work or data or distribution networks. But then her assistant knocked, and the moment dissolved. Ms. Hart, your 10:30 is here. Thank you, David. She stood, and Ethan took the cue, rising as well. Keep doing what you're doing, Mr. Cole. I'm looking forward to your next insight. Ethan left her office feeling like he'd just survived something intense and undefined. The elevator ride down felt longer than it should have, and his reflection in the polished doors showed a man who looked slightly dazed. He had a job to do, a good job, an important job, one that could finally give him and Mia the stability they desperately needed. The last thing he could afford was to complicate that with feelings that had no place in his professional life. Even if those feelings had started in the back seat of a car, on a rain-soaked October morning when he'd accidentally told the truth to a woman he was supposed to impress. Even if, when he closed his eyes, he could still see the way she'd looked at him and said that being a parent who showed up wasn't a weakness. Even if he was starting to suspect that Vivian Hart was the most compelling person he'd ever met. It didn't matter. It couldn't matter. Ethan returned to his desk, opened his spreadsheets, and got back to work. The weeks that followed established a rhythm that felt almost sustainable. Ethan arrived early, stayed late, and threw himself into the distribution network project with the kind of focused intensity that came from finally having work that mattered. The data revealed itself to him in layers, patterns emerging from what others saw as chaos, opportunities hiding in plain sight within spreadsheets that most people found overwhelming. He was good at this, better than good, and for the first time in years, people were noticing. Richard began pulling him into meetings with senior leadership, asking for his input on decisions that went far beyond his official job description. Sharon started stopping by his desk with questions about vendor performance metrics. Even Patricia, the CFO, who'd seemed skeptical during his interview, sent him a brief email after he identified a billing discrepancy that had been costing the company $30,000 monthly for over a year. Sharp eye, Cole. Keep it up. But it was Vivian's attention that both energized and unsettled him. She attended every project team meeting, sitting at the end of the table with her laptop open, asking questions that cut through assumptions and forced everyone to defend their conclusions with data rather than instinct. She was brilliant in a way that made Ethan's chest tight, the kind of intelligence that didn't just process information, but transformed it into strategy, into vision, into action. And she watched him. Not obviously, not in a way anyone else would notice, but Ethan felt it. When he presented findings, when he pushed back on flawed analysis, when he stayed quiet because he was still learning the political landscape, her eyes would find him across the room. Brief glances, nothing more, but they landed with weight. He told himself it meant nothing. She was his boss's boss's boss, a woman who existed in a stratosphere so far above his own that the very idea of anything beyond professional respect was absurd. She probably looked at everyone that way with that focused intensity that made you feel like the only person in the room, probably. "Dad, you're doing it again." Ethan blinked and looked down at Mia, who sat across from him at their small kitchen table, her homework spread out between her apple slices and juice box. "Doing what?" "Staring at nothing with your thinking face." She scrunched up her nose in imitation of his expression. "Is work stuff?" "Yeah, baby, sorry." He reached over and helped her sound out the word she'd been struggling with. "What else do you have?" "Just the math worksheet, but I already finished it." She beamed with pride. "Miss Rodriguez said my multiplication facts are getting really good." "That's because you're brilliant," Ethan said, ruffling her hair. She squealed and ducked away, laughing. These moments, these ordinary evenings of homework and dinner and bedtime stories, they were what mattered. They were what he'd been fighting for all along. The new job had already changed things in small but meaningful ways. The good mac and cheese, yes, but also new sneakers that actually fit. A winter coat that wasn't handed down from a cousin, the ability to say yes to the school field trip without calculating whether it meant skipping lunch for 3 days. Stability, security, the radical luxury of not being terrified all the time. His phone buzzed with an email notification. Ethan almost ignored it, focused on helping Mia clean up her homework, but something made him glance at the screen. Team dinner Thursday at Morton's, 7 p.m. Project milestone celebration. Attendance expected. R. Chen Morton's. Ethan had walked past that steakhouse 100 times, had seen the prices on the menu posted outside, had never imagined actually eating there. His first instinct was to calculate the cost, to worry about whether he should offer to pay his share, to feel that familiar clench of anxiety about money. Then he remembered that he worked for hard industries now, that this was part of his job, part of the world he was joining. He could afford it. Maybe not easily, Not yet, but he could. "What's Thursday?" Mia asked, catching his expression. "Work dinner. Miss Angela will pick you up from school and stay with you until I get home." Mia's face fell. "Another late night?" Guilt twisted in Ethan's stomach. The new job meant better pay, better opportunities, but it also meant longer hours, more time away from the person who mattered most. "I know, baby. I'm sorry. But remember what we talked about? How this job is going to make things better for us." "I remember." She sighed dramatically, with the weight of the world on her 6-year-old shoulders. "It's okay, Daddy. Miss Angela brings good snacks." Ethan pulled her into a hug, breathing in the strawberry scent of her shampoo, feeling the solid warmth of her small body against his chest. Everything he did, every choice he made, it all came back to this. To her. To making sure she had the childhood she deserved, even if it meant sacrificing time together in the short term. He just hoped she understood that. Hoped she wouldn't grow up resenting the hours he spent at the office, the dinners he missed, the school events he couldn't attend because of meetings that couldn't be moved. Hoped he wasn't making a terrible mistake. Thursday evening found Ethan standing outside Morton's in the one good suit he owned, watching through the windows as his colleagues gathered at a large table near the back. They all looked comfortable here, at ease in their expensive clothes, laughing easily over cocktails that probably cost $40 each. He could do this. He belonged here now. Ethan pushed through the door and made his way to the table, where Richard spotted him immediately and waved him over. "There he is. Ethan, you know everyone. Grab a seat." The only empty chair was at the far end of the table, next to Sharon and directly across from Vivian Hart. Of course it was. Ethan sat, hyper-aware of Vivian's presence, of the way her gray suit jacket was perfectly tailored, of the simple gold watch on her wrist that had probably cost more than his car. She was reading something on her phone, seemingly absorbed, but as soon as he settled into his chair, she looked up and met his eyes. "Mr. Cole, I'm glad you could make it." "Thank you for including me," Ethan said, reaching for the water glass that had already been filled. His throat felt dry. "You've earned it." She set her phone aside. "Your analysis of the facility consolidation options was exactly what the board needed to see. They approved the recommendation this afternoon." Richard overheard and raised his glass. "To Ethan, whose fresh perspective has already saved this company more money than most people make in a decade." The team raised their glasses in a chorus of agreement. Ethan felt heat creep up his neck, embarrassed by the attention but also deeply, genuinely pleased. He'd done good work. Work that mattered. Work that people valued. He caught Vivian watching him over the rim of her wine glass, and something in her expression made his pulse quicken. Pride, maybe. Or recognition. The kind of look that said she saw him, really saw him, not just as an employee, but as a person who'd fought for this moment and earned it. The dinner progressed through multiple courses, each more elaborate than the last. Ethan listened as his colleagues talked about their weekend plans, their kids' college applications, their upcoming vacations to places he'd only seen in magazines. He contributed when he could, but mostly, he observed, learning the social rhythms of this new world he was trying to join. "What about you, Ethan?" Sharon asked during a lull in conversation. "Any plans for the holidays?" "My daughter's school does a winter concert," Ethan said. "That's pretty much the highlight of our season. Mia's been practicing her songs for weeks." "How old is she?" Patricia asked from down the table. 6, first grade. Ethan pulled out his phone and showed them his lock screen, a photo of Mia grinning gap-toothed at the camera, her curly hair wild around her face. "She's the best thing that ever happened to me." The warmth in his voice must have been obvious, because several people smiled. Richard said something about his own grandchildren, and the conversation shifted, but Ethan noticed that Vivian had gone very still, her eyes fixed on the photo he'd shown. When he looked up, she quickly glanced away, reaching for her wine glass. The rest of the dinner passed in a pleasant blur of conversation and excellent food. By the time dessert arrived, Ethan felt himself relaxing into the evening, enjoying the camaraderie, the sense of being part of a team that respected his contributions. As people began gathering their things to leave, Vivian stood and addressed the table. "Before we go, I want to acknowledge the work this team has accomplished. The distribution network restructuring is ahead of schedule and under budget, which never happens. You should all be proud." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the group before landing on Ethan. And I want to especially recognize our newest team member, who brought exactly the kind of analytical rigor and creative problem-solving we needed. Well done, Mr. Cole. The team applauded lightly, and Ethan nodded his thanks, trying not to read too much into the way she'd singled him out, the way her voice had softened just slightly on his name. Outside the restaurant, the November air bit sharp and cold. People said their goodbyes, calling out plans to meet for coffee, reminders about upcoming deadlines. Ethan was pulling out his phone to call a rideshare when Vivian appeared beside him. "Do you need a ride?" His heart stuttered. "I was just going to get an Uber." "I have a car," she said, gesturing to the black sedan idling at the curb. The same car. The same driver's seat where she'd sat that rainy October morning while he'd poured out his life story without knowing who was listening. "I can drop you." It would be smart to say no. Professional, appropriate. But Ethan found himself nodding, following her to the car, sliding into the back seat while she took the wheel. The interior smelled faintly of leather and something subtle and expensive, probably her perfume. Vivian adjusted the rearview mirror and glanced back at him. "Where to?" Ethan gave her his address, watching her expression for any sign of judgment. His neighborhood was fine, safe enough, but it was a world away from the waterfront condos and historic brownstones where people like Vivian Hart lived. She simply nodded and pulled into traffic. For the first few minutes, neither of them spoke. The silence felt different from that first morning, less charged with panic, but still weighted with something undefined. Ethan watched the city slide past outside the windows, the lights blurring into streaks of gold and red. "Your daughter," Vivian said suddenly. "What's she like?" The question surprised him. "Mia, she's incredible, smart, funny, stubborn as hell." He smiled despite himself. "She taught herself to read before kindergarten because she was tired of waiting for me to finish reading her bedtime stories. Now she carries chapter books everywhere." "She gets that from you," Vivian said. "The stubbornness and the intelligence." "I don't know about the intelligence, but yeah, she's definitely stubborn." Ethan leaned forward slightly. "What about you? Do you have family in Boston?" Vivian's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the steering wheel. "My parents live in Connecticut. I see them for holidays. I have a brother in California who I talk to maybe 3 times a year." She paused. "It's not a close family." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It's simply the way things are." She glanced at him in the mirror. "I've built my own family, in a sense. The company, the people who work there, the legacy we're creating together, that's what matters to me." Ethan heard the truth in her words, but also the loneliness underneath. Here was a woman who had everything by conventional measures: wealth, power, respect, success. But she spent her Thursday evenings having dinner with employees because she had no one else to have dinner with. The realization made something crack open in his chest. "Still," he said quietly, "that sounds lonely." Vivian met his eyes in the mirror, and for a moment the professional distance between them dissolved completely. She looked vulnerable, caught off guard by his directness, and Ethan saw her not as his CEO, but as a person who'd made choices and sacrifices that he was only beginning to understand. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but loneliness is better than compromise. I learned that a long time ago." She pulled up in front of his building, an aging apartment complex with a broken fountain and a security gate that never quite closed properly. Ethan saw her take it in, processing the contrast between this and the gleaming Hart Industries tower, and braced himself for pity or judgment. Instead, she said, "Thank you for joining us tonight. Your presence on the team makes a difference." "Thank you for the ride." Ethan reached for the door handle, then hesitated. "And Miss Hart? What you said about loneliness and compromise, I think maybe there's a middle ground, if you're willing to look for it." He got out before she could respond, but he felt her watching as he walked toward his building, felt the weight of her gaze like a physical touch. Inside, Ms. Angela reported that Mia had been an angel, eaten all her dinner, and was now fast asleep. Ethan paid her, locked up, and stood in his small living room feeling like he'd just crossed some invisible line he hadn't meant to approach. He'd been too familiar. Too personal. She was his boss, and he'd basically told her she needed to open up her life. But when he checked his phone before bed, There was an email from an unknown sender with no subject line. Perhaps you're right. V. Ethan stared at those 3 words for a long time before finally turning off his phone and trying to sleep. The next morning brought a crisis that pushed all personal thoughts firmly aside. Ethan arrived at the office to find Richard pacing outside the conference room, his usually calm demeanor replaced by obvious stress. "We have a problem," Richard said without preamble. The Seattle facility reported a major inventory discrepancy. We're talking about $200,000 worth of product that's either missing, miscounted, or misallocated. The audit team is flying out today, but we need to figure out what happened before this becomes a PR disaster. "Do we have access to their inventory management system?" Ethan asked, already pulling out his laptop. "Yes, but it's a mess. They've been using a different platform than the rest of our facilities, and the data integration is inconsistent at best. Let me see what I can find." For the next 6 hours, Ethan dove into the Seattle facility's records, cross-referencing shipment logs, receiving reports, and inventory counts. He pulled data from 3 different systems, built a reconciliation model, and traced every product movement for the past 90 days. What he found made his blood run cold. "Richard," he called across the office. Can you come here?" Richard appeared at his desk, followed by Sharon and 2 other team members who'd been pulled into the crisis. "What did you find?" "It's not a discrepancy," Ethan said, turning his laptop so they could see the spreadsheet he'd built. "It's theft. Look at these patterns. Every Friday for the past 3 months, inventory counts dropped by exactly the same percentage. Not random amounts, not variable numbers. The same percentage every single week." Sharon leaned closer. "That's not possible unless someone's cooking the books." "Exactly." Ethan highlighted a series of transactions. "Someone with system access has been adjusting the counts after shipments go out, making it look like we received less than we actually did. Then they're walking out with the difference." "Who has that level of access?" Richard asked, his voice tight. "Only 3 people at that facility. The operations manager, the warehouse supervisor, and the IT administrator." Richard pulled out his phone. "I need to call Ms. Hart." 20 minutes later, Ethan found himself in Vivian's office again. This time with Richard, Patricia, and the head of corporate security. He walked them through his analysis, showing exactly how the theft had been executed and why it had gone undetected for so long. Vivian listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she turned to the security director. "I want all 3 suspects interviewed today. Separate rooms, recorded sessions, and I want a complete audit of every facility's inventory system by the end of next week." "Yes, ma'am." She looked at Patricia. "How much can we recover?" "If we move fast and involve law enforcement, maybe 60%. "Do it." Vivian's voice was cold, controlled, the voice of someone who'd built an empire by never tolerating threats to it. Then she turned to Ethan. "How long did this analysis take you?" "About 6 hours. And how long has our audit team been working on this?" "They started yesterday afternoon," Richard said quietly. Vivian nodded slowly. "Mr. Cole, you've just prevented what could have been a catastrophic loss for this company. More than that, you've exposed a systematic vulnerability in our inventory controls." She stood, and everyone else stood with her. "Richard, I want Ethan's recommendations for improving our systems on my desk by Monday, and I want him leading the implementation." "That's a significant expansion of his current role," Patricia noted. "Then expand his role." Vivian's eyes found Ethan's across the desk. "Unless you think he can't handle it?" "I think he's the best hire we've made in 5 years," Richard said firmly. "Good. Then we're agreed." Vivian gathered her papers. "Gentlemen, Patricia, thank you. Ethan, stay a moment." The others filed out, and suddenly it was just the 2 of them again. The city spread out behind her through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Vivian walked to the window and stood there, her back to him, her silhouette sharp against the afternoon light. "Do you know what separates good employees from exceptional ones?" she asked. "No. Good employees do what they're told. Exceptional ones see what needs to be done and do it without being asked." She turned to face him. "You didn't wait for someone to assign you this problem. You saw it, you solved it, and you brought forward a solution that protects this company's future." "I was just doing my job," Ethan said. "No, you were doing the job I hired you to do, which is significantly more than your official job description. She moved closer, and Ethan felt his pulse accelerate. I want you to understand something. The expansion of your role, the increased responsibility, the recognition you're receiving, you've earned all of it. This isn't favoritism. This isn't charity. This is merit. The intensity in her voice made Ethan's throat tight. She needed him to know that, needed him to believe it. Because she knew what people would think, what they might already be thinking, if they'd seen her give him a ride home, if they'd noticed the way she looked at him during meetings. I know, he said, and I'm grateful. Don't be grateful, be excellent, that's all I ask. She was standing close enough now that he could see the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, the slight tension in her jaw, the way her breathing had changed. The air between them felt electric, dangerous, full of things neither of them could say. Ethan took a step back. I should get back to work. The system analysis won't write itself. Something flickered across Vivian's face. Disappointment or relief, or maybe both. Of course. Keep me updated on your progress. He made it to the door before she spoke again. Ethan. It was the first time she'd used his first name in the office. He turned back and found her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Thank you, she said simply. For solving the problem, he told himself. For protecting the company. For being good at his job. Not for anything else. Not for seeing her loneliness and acknowledging it. Not for being someone she could talk to honestly, even if only in the front seat of a car late at night. Not for any of the things that were starting to matter more than they should. Any time, Ethan said, and left before he could make the mistake of saying anything more. The expansion of his role came with a promotion and a raise, or boostes, that made Ethan's hands shake when he saw the offer letter. He was now Senior Manager of Operational Analytics, reporting directly to Richard, but working closely with all the C-suite executives on strategic initiatives. It meant longer hours, higher stakes, more visibility. It also meant he could finally breathe, financially. Could start saving for Mia's future. Could fix the things in their apartment that had been broken for months. Could stop calculating the cost of every single purchase. He took Mia out for ice cream to celebrate, to a place with flavors beyond chocolate and vanilla, and watched her face light up as she tried salted caramel for the first time. Is this because of your big job? She asked, chocolate sauce on her chin. Yeah, baby, this is because of my big job. Then I'm glad you have it, Mia said seriously, even if you have to work late sometimes. Ethan pulled her close, kissed the top of her head, and promised himself he'd find balance, that he wouldn't let success in his career come at the cost of being the father she needed. But as December approached and the company's annual gala loomed on the calendar, Ethan found himself increasingly aware that balance might be harder to maintain than he'd thought, because every interaction with Vivian felt like walking a tightrope. Every meeting where their eyes met across the conference table, every email exchange that lasted one message longer than necessary, every moment of understanding that passed between them without words, all of it was pulling him toward something he knew he couldn't afford to want. She was brilliant and driven and lonely in ways that called to his own loneliness. She saw him not as a struggling single father barely keeping his head above water, but as someone capable and valuable and worth investing in. And when she looked at him, really looked at him, Ethan felt seen in a way he hadn't experienced since before Mia's mother left, since before his life became nothing but survival and sacrifice and making it through one more day. It was intoxicating, it was dangerous, and it was growing stronger every day, no matter how hard he tried to ignore it. The company gala invitation arrived in his inbox with 2 weeks' notice. Black tie, attendance strongly encouraged for senior management, +1 welcome. Ethan stared at the invitation and knew, with absolute certainty, that attending would be a mistake. That being in the same room with Vivian Hart outside of work hours, in an evening gown instead of a business suit, with music and dim lighting and the excuse of celebration lowering everyone's defenses, that would be the moment when his careful self-control finally crumbled. He should make an excuse. He should claim a conflict, a family emergency, anything to avoid putting himself in that situation. But he didn't, because somewhere beneath the fear and the professionalism and the very rational arguments for staying away, Ethan wanted to go. Wanted to see what might happen if, just for one evening, he stopped pretending that what he felt for Vivian Hart was purely professional respect. The gala was 3 weeks away. He had 3 weeks to decide whether he was brave enough or foolish enough to find out what came next. 3 weeks turned into 2, then 1, and suddenly the gala was 48 hours away, and Ethan still hadn't figured out what he was going to do. The rational part of his brain kept listing all the reasons he should skip it: the cost of renting a tuxedo, the awkwardness of attending alone, the risk of letting his carefully maintained professional boundaries slip after a few glasses of champagne. But every time he started composing an excuse email to Richard, his finger would hover over the send button and refuse to press down. "You're thinking too hard again," Mia announced from her spot on the couch, where she was supposedly doing her reading homework, but was actually watching him pace their small living room. "How can you tell?" Ethan asked, stopping mid-stride. "You get this wrinkle right here," she pointed to the space between her eyebrows, "and you walk back and forth like you're trying to wear out the carpet." Ethan sat down beside her, pulling her into his lap even though she was getting too big for it, her legs dangling nearly to the floor now. "When did you get so observant?" "I've always been observant. You just don't always notice me noticing." She twisted to look up at him, her expression suddenly serious. "Is it about the fancy party?" He shouldn't be surprised that she knew. Mia absorbed everything, filed it away, understood far more than most adults gave her credit for. "Yeah, baby, it's about the party. Are you scared to go?" The question landed with unexpected accuracy. Ethan considered lying, giving her some sanitized adult answer about scheduling conflicts or professional obligations, but Mia deserved better than that. She always had. "A little bit scared," he admitted. "It's a really important event, and everyone there will be dressed up fancy, and I'm worried about fitting in." Mia frowned, processing this. "But you're already important at your job. You told me they gave you a promotion because you're so good at finding problems in numbers." "That's true." "So why does it matter what you wear to a party? You'll still be the same person who's good at your job." Out of the mouths of 6-year-olds, Ethan hugged her tighter, breathing in the strawberry scent of her shampoo, feeling the weight of her complete faith in him. To Mia, the world was simple. Her dad was smart and capable, and anyone who couldn't see that wasn't paying attention. If only adult reality worked that way. "You're right," he said. I'm being silly." "You should go," Mia said firmly. "And you should wear your nice suit that makes you look like a businessman. And you should have fun, because you never have fun anymore." The last part hurt precisely because it was true. When had he last done something just for enjoyment? When had he last gone somewhere that wasn't work or Mia's school or the grocery store? His entire life had narrowed to responsibility and survival, and he'd accepted that as the natural order of things. But maybe, just this once, he could step outside that narrow corridor. Maybe he could go to the gala and allow himself to enjoy it, to feel like someone who belonged in rooms with crystal chandeliers and orchestra music, to stand beside Vivian Hart and not feel the weight of all the reasons why he shouldn't want to. "Okay," Ethan said. "I'll go. But that means Ms. Angela will be here with you Friday night." "That's okay. Ms. Angela lets me stay up an extra 30 minutes. Mia grinned, pleased with herself for negotiating this particular privilege. Ethan made a mental note to have a conversation with Ms. Angela about bedtimes. But for now, he just held his daughter close and tried to ignore the anxiety twisting in his stomach. The tuxedo rental shop was tucked into a narrow storefront between a dry cleaner and a nail salon, the kind of place Ethan had walked past 100 times without ever imagining he'd need to go inside. The teenager behind the counter looked barely old enough to drive, but he sized Ethan up with professional efficiency and disappeared into the back room. "First formal event?" he called out. "Is it that obvious?" Ethan asked. "Nah, man. You just look nervous, but don't stress. Once you're in the tux, you'll feel like James Bond or whatever." The kid returned with an armload of black fabric and gestured toward the dressing room. 20 minutes later, Ethan stood in front of a full-length mirror and barely recognized himself. The tuxedo fit perfectly, transforming him from a tired single father in discount business casual into someone who looked like he belonged at a company gala. He took a photo and sent it to Mia with the caption, "How do I look?" Her response came immediately, "Daddy, you look so handsome," followed by approximately 15 heart emojis. Ethan smiled, paid for the rental, and carried the garment bag home feeling like he'd just committed to something far bigger than simply attending a party. Friday evening arrived with unseasonable warmth, one of those strange December nights when Boston forgot it was supposed to be winter. Ethan dressed carefully in his apartment bathroom while Mia supervised, offering commentary on his tie-tying abilities and insisting he use the cologne she'd given him for his birthday last year. "Remember, if you don't know which fork to use, just watch what everyone else does," Mia said seriously, like she was sending him off to war rather than a corporate event. "Where did you learn that?" Ethan asked, amused. "A book about manners that Ms. Rodriguez has in our classroom library." She smoothed down his lapel with grave concentration. "Also, stand up straight and smile even if you're nervous, because people can tell when you're confident." "You're 6 years old. How are you giving me advice that sounds like it came from a life coach?" "I'm very mature for my age," Mia said with complete seriousness. Miss Angela arrived right on time, and Ethan went through the usual litany of instructions. Bedtime at 8:30, no more than 1 hour of screen time, vegetables before dessert. Miss Angela nodded patiently, having heard all of this before, and shooed him toward the door. "Go! Have fun! Stop worrying! We'll be fine!" The gala was being held at the Fairmont Copley Plaza, a historic hotel that dripped old money and established elegance. Ethan's rideshare dropped him at the entrance, where a steady stream of well-dressed people flowed through doors held open by staff in crisp uniforms. He followed the crowd inside, trying to look like he knew where he was going, trying to ignore the voice in his head that kept insisting he'd made a terrible mistake. The ballroom took his breath away. Crystal chandeliers hung from soaring ceilings, casting warm light over hundreds of people in evening wear. A string quartet played in one corner while waiters circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres that probably cost more per bite than Ethan used to spend on entire meals. "Ethan, you made it!" Sharon appeared at his elbow, stunning in a deep blue gown, her usual professional demeanor replaced by genuine warmth. "I wasn't sure you'd come. First company gala? That obvious?" "Only because you look like you're about to bolt." She handed him a champagne flute from a passing tray. "Relax, it's just a party. Admittedly, a very expensive party where everyone's trying to impress everyone else, but still just a party." "That's not helping," Ethan said, but he took the champagne anyway. Sharon laughed and steered him toward a cluster of their colleagues from the distribution project. Richard was there with his wife, Patricia had brought her husband, and several other familiar faces greeted Ethan with the kind of easy camaraderie that came from weeks of working intensive hours together. The conversation flowed around safe topics: the food, the venue, the band that would start playing later. Ethan sipped his champagne slowly, hyper-aware of his surroundings, scanning the room without meaning to, looking for someone specific, someone he hadn't seen yet but knew was here somewhere, because Vivian Hart never missed company events that mattered. "She's upstairs," Sharon said quietly, appearing beside him again. "Meeting with some board members before she makes her entrance. But she'll be down soon." Ethan felt heat creep up his neck. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure you don't." Sharon's smile was knowing, but not unkind. "For what it's worth, I think you're good for her. She's been different since you started. More engaged, more present. Like she remembers there are actual humans working here, not just profit margins and quarterly reports." Before Ethan could figure out how to respond to that, a subtle shift rippled through the room. Conversations paused mid-sentence, heads turned toward the grand staircase, and Ethan followed their gaze to see Vivian descending. She wore a floor-length gown in deep emerald silk that caught the light with every step, her dark hair loose around her shoulders instead of pulled back, her usual armor of professional distance replaced by something softer, but no less powerful. She looked like someone who'd walked out of an old Hollywood film, elegant and untouchable and absolutely magnetic. Ethan forgot to breathe. Vivian reached the bottom of the stairs and was immediately surrounded by board members and executives, all of them vying for a moment of her attention. She handled them with practiced grace, smiling and nodding, saying whatever needed to be said to satisfy their egos while her eyes swept the room. When her gaze found Ethan's across the crowded ballroom, she went very still. Just for a second, just long enough for him to see recognition flash across her face, followed by something that looked almost like relief. Then someone said something to her, and the moment broke. She turned back to the board chairman, laughing at whatever joke he'd made, and Ethan forced himself to breathe again. "Oh, you've got it bad," Sharon murmured beside him. "I really don't know what you're talking about," Ethan said weakly. "Uh-huh. Keep telling yourself that." The evening progressed through dinner, speeches, and the inevitable networking that came with any corporate event. Ethan found himself talking to people he'd only known through email chains and conference calls, discovering that most of them were more human and less intimidating in person. He made connections, exchanged business cards, fielded questions about his work on the distribution project with growing confidence. But through it all, he was aware of Vivian's presence the way a compass is aware of magnetic north. She moved through the room like royalty, stopping at each table to greet employees, remembering names and asking after families with the kind of detailed attention that made people feel valued. She was brilliant at this, Ethan realized, at making a room full of hundreds feel like individual relationships, at wielding her power with grace instead of intimidation. She reached their table around 9 o'clock, just as the band was setting up for dancing. Ethan stood with everyone else as she approached, his heart hammering against his ribs like it was trying to escape. "Good evening, everyone," Vivian said, her voice warm but professional. "I hope you're all enjoying yourselves." A chorus of enthusiastic responses. She spoke briefly with Richard about an upcoming board presentation, complimented Patricia's husband on a recent article he'd published, asked Sharon about her son's college applications. And then, finally, inevitably, she turned to Ethan. "Mr. Cole, I'm glad you could attend." "Thank you for the invitation, Ms. Hart." His voice came out steady, which felt like a minor miracle. "I heard the inventory control implementation is ahead of schedule. Excellent work." "The team has been very responsive," Ethan said, deflecting credit the way he'd learned to do in corporate environments. Vivian's lips quirked in a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yes, well, good teams need good leadership." She held his gaze for a beat longer than necessary, then moved on to the next table, leaving Ethan standing there feeling like he'd just survived something intense and undefined. "Smooth," Sharon said under her breath. "Shut up," Ethan muttered back. The band started playing and couples drifted toward the dance floor. Ethan watched them, feeling suddenly awkward and out of place. He didn't belong here, among people who waltzed effortlessly and made small talk about vacation homes and stock portfolios. He was a guy who'd been eating ramen for dinner 6 months ago, who'd once seriously considered selling his car to make rent, who was only here because of a bizarre accident involving a rideshare mistake and a rainy morning. "Dance with me," Sharon said, grabbing his hand. "I'm a terrible dancer," Ethan protested. "I don't care, you look like you're about to have a panic attack and dancing will help." She dragged him onto the floor before he could argue further. Sharon was right. He was a terrible dancer, but she was patient and funny about his missteps. And after a few minutes, Ethan found himself actually enjoying it. The music was good, the champagne had taken the edge off his anxiety, and for a little while he could pretend he was just a normal person at a normal party having a normal good time. The song ended and Sharon released him with a grin. "See? Not so bad. Now go get some water before you dehydrate." Ethan made his way toward the bar, weaving through clusters of conversation, when a hand caught his elbow. He turned to find Vivian standing there, slightly apart from the crowd, her expression unreadable in the dim lighting. "Walk with me?" she asked quietly. It wasn't really a question. Ethan nodded and followed her through a side door that led to a hallway, then up a flight of stairs to a terrace that overlooked the city. The December air was cool, but not cold, and the noise from the ballroom faded to a distant murmur behind them. They were alone. Vivian moved to the railing, her hands resting on the stone balustrade, her profile sharp against the city lights. Ethan stayed a careful distance away, not trusting himself to get closer. "I almost didn't come tonight," Vivian said after a long silence. "Why not?" "Because I knew you'd be here, and I knew it would be difficult to maintain appropriate professional distance in a setting like this." She turned to face him. "I've been very careful, Ethan, very deliberate about keeping our interactions professional, about never giving anyone reason to question my judgment or your merit." "I know," Ethan said. "I've been careful too." "Yes, you have. And yet here we are, alone on a terrace, having a conversation that we both know we shouldn't be having." Ethan's throat felt tight. "What conversation is that?" Vivian laughed, but it was a sad sound, full of frustration and resignation. "The one where I admit that I think about you far more than I should, where I confess that I look forward to our meetings for reasons that have nothing to do with operational analytics, where I acknowledge that driving you home that night was the highlight of my entire week, which is pathetic but true." The honesty in her voice stripped away every defense Ethan had carefully constructed. Vivian, don't. She held up a hand. Please don't make this harder than it already is. I'm your superior. You report to my direct reports. There are rules, policies, ethical considerations that exist for very good reasons. And more than that, there are optics. If people thought I was showing you favoritism, it would undermine everything you've accomplished. Every promotion, every recognition, every opportunity would be tainted by the assumption that you earned it on your back instead of through merit. I would never let anyone think that, Ethan said fiercely. You wouldn't have a choice. The rumor mill doesn't care about truth. Vivian's expression was anguished now, all her careful control cracking. I've worked too hard, sacrificed too much to let my company be damaged by scandal, and you've worked too hard to have your career destroyed by association with me. So what are you saying? Ethan asked, even though he already knew the answer. I'm saying we can't do this. Whatever this is, whatever it might become, we can't pursue it. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking fragile in a way he'd never seen before. I'm saying that I need to put distance between us. Professional distance, real distance. Because if I don't, I'm going to do something incredibly stupid like kiss you, and then everything we've both worked for will fall apart. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and devastating. Ethan wanted to argue, to tell her that they could figure it out, that feelings this strong didn't come along often enough to be ignored. But he looked at her face and saw the fear there, the genuine terror of losing control, of letting someone matter enough to threaten the empire she'd built. And he understood, because he had his own empire to protect. A much smaller one, consisting of a 6-year-old girl who depended on him to make good decisions, to keep his job, to provide stability even when his heart was pulling him toward risk. Okay, Ethan said quietly. I understand. Vivian's eyes glistened, but she didn't let herself cry. I'm sorry. Don't be. You're right. About all of it. He took a step back, putting physical distance between them to match the emotional distance she was demanding. I should go back inside. Wait. Vivian reached out, then dropped her hand before making contact. I need you to know that everything I said about your work, about your value to this company, that's all true. You're exceptional at what you do, and you've earned every opportunity you've received. Please don't doubt that. I won't, Ethan promised, even though doubt was already creeping in, whispering that maybe she'd only noticed his work because she'd noticed him first, that maybe none of it was as clean and merit-based as they both wanted to believe. He left her standing on the terrace and made his way back to the ballroom, where the party continued oblivious to the quiet devastation that had just occurred one floor above. Sharon caught his eye from across the room and started to approach, but Ethan shook his head slightly. He couldn't talk about it, couldn't process it, could barely hold himself together long enough to make polite excuses about needing to leave early, about Mia having a cold, about anything that would let him escape without drawing attention. The cool night air hit him like a slap when he finally made it outside. Ethan stood on the hotel steps, waiting for his rideshare, feeling hollowed out and exhausted. He'd known this would happen. Had known from the moment he accepted the gala invitation that getting close to Vivian Hart would end in exactly this kind of painful retreat. But knowing didn't make it hurt less. His phone buzzed with a text from Ms. Angela. Mia's asleep. Take your time. Enjoy the party. Ethan almost laughed. Enjoy the party. Right. The drive home passed in a blur of streetlights and late-night traffic. Ethan paid Ms. Angela, checked on Mia sleeping peacefully in her bed, and then stood in his small bathroom staring at his reflection in the tuxedo that had made him feel, briefly, like someone who belonged in Vivian Hart's world. He didn't belong there. He never had. And now he had to figure out how to work alongside her, to see her in meetings and presentations and casual hallway conversations, knowing exactly how she felt, and knowing that neither of them could act on it. It should have been simple. People managed unrequited feelings all the time. You acknowledged them, accepted them, and moved on with your life. But as Ethan carefully hung up the tuxedo and crawled into bed, he couldn't shake the memory of Vivian's voice when she'd said she thought about him far more than she should. Couldn't forget the way she'd looked at him on the terrace, like she was drowning, and he was the only lifeline she couldn't reach for. He didn't sleep that night, just lay in the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of his apartment, and tried to convince himself that professional distance was possible when every cell in his body wanted the exact opposite. The following Monday, Ethan arrived at work early and threw himself into the inventory control implementation with single-minded focus. Work was safe. Work was measurable. Work didn't require him to navigate complicated emotions or wonder what might have happened if Vivian hadn't been his boss, if he hadn't been a single father with everything to lose, if the universe had arranged their lives differently. Richard stopped by his desk around 10. Good weekend? Fine, Ethan lied. Mia had a cold, so we stayed in mostly. The gala was a success. Ms. Hart seemed pleased. Ethan's hands stilled on his keyboard. Good to hear. Richard lingered, and Ethan could feel him preparing to say something more, something that would require actual conversation instead of just polite deflection. But before he could, Ethan's phone rang. Mia's school. His heart dropped. I need to take this, he said, and Richard nodded, moving away. Mr. Cole? This is Nurse Morrison at Riverside Elementary. Mia's running a fever and she's asking for you. Can you come pick her up? 20 minutes later, Ethan was signing Mia out of school and carrying her to his car, her small body hot against his chest. She whimpered about her throat hurting, and Ethan made soothing sounds while his mind raced through logistics. He couldn't take her to daycare sick. Ms. Angela was visiting her daughter this week. His emergency backup sitter had moved to Providence last month, which meant he needed to take her home and work from there, assuming Richard would approve that on short notice. He got Mia settled on the couch with her favorite blanket and called his boss. Of course, take the day, Richard said immediately. Take tomorrow too if she needs it. Family comes first, Ethan. We've got things covered here. The relief was overwhelming. This was what the new job had given him. The flexibility to be the parent Mia needed without fearing for his employment. The security to make doctor's appointments and handle sick days without calculating whether it meant losing his position. He'd fought so hard for this, and he couldn't jeopardize it, not for anything. Ethan spent the afternoon alternating between answering emails and checking Mia's temperature, between conference calls on mute and preparing soup that she barely touched. By evening, she was feverish enough that he considered urgent care, but she fell asleep curled against him on the couch, and he didn't want to wake her. His laptop was open on the coffee table, showing the inventory analysis he was supposed to be finishing, when an email notification appeared. From Vivian Hart. Subject line, checking in. Ethan's finger hovered over the touchpad, knowing he should delete it unread, knowing that any communication beyond strictly professional was a step backward from the distance she'd demanded. He opened it anyway. Richard mentioned your daughter is ill. I hope she recovers quickly. Please don't hesitate to take whatever time you need. Also, I've arranged for a care package to be delivered to your address tomorrow. Just some soup and basics that might help. Consider it a standard company benefit for employees dealing with family illness. It isn't a standard company benefit, but it should be. I'm adding it to our policy recommendations for the next board meeting. Take care of her. Take care of yourself. V. Ethan read the email 3 times, his throat tight. This was Vivian trying to help while maintaining plausible deniability, trying to show she cared while keeping it wrapped in corporate policy speak. And the fact that she was actually going to implement it as real policy, that she was using this moment to improve things for all employees, was so fundamentally her that it made his chest ache. He couldn't do this, couldn't navigate the impossible space between professional respect and personal feelings, couldn't maintain walls that kept crumbling every time she showed him who she really was beneath the CEO armor. But he had to, because Mia was depending on him, and his career was finally stable, and risking everything for feelings that couldn't lead anywhere was the definition of self-destruction. Ethan closed the laptop without responding to the email. He shifted Mia more comfortably in his lap, checked her forehead again, and made himself a promise. He would do his job brilliantly, would continue proving his worth through measurable results, and would accept that some connections, no matter how powerful, were meant to remain unacted upon. It was the responsible choice, the mature choice, the only choice that made sense. So why did it feel like he was slowly suffocating? The care package arrived the next morning while Mia was still asleep, her fever finally broken after a long night of restless tossing. Ethan opened the door to find not a standard delivery box, but an insulated cooler containing homemade chicken soup in glass containers, crackers, electrolyte drinks, children's medicine, and a small stuffed bear holding a card that read "Get well soon," in elegant handwriting he recognized immediately. He stood in his doorway holding the bear, feeling something crack open in his chest that he'd been trying desperately to keep sealed. This wasn't a corporate gesture. This was personal care disguised as policy, Vivian's way of reaching across the distance she'd demanded and saying she still saw him, still cared, even if she couldn't admit it directly. Ethan brought everything inside and put the soup on to warm, then sat at his kitchen table with his phone in his hand, composing and deleting a dozen different responses before finally settling on something safe. "Thank you for the care package. Mia loved the bear. I'll review the policy proposal when I'm back in the office. Professional. Appropriate. Completely inadequate for what he actually wanted to say." Her response came within minutes. "Good. See you Thursday." 3 days. He had 3 days away from the office, away from her presence, to rebuild the walls that kept crumbling. 3 days to remember why professional distance mattered more than the way his heart raced every time he saw her name in his inbox. Mia woke up around noon, groggy but improved, and immediately spotted the bear on the couch. "Who's that from?" "My work," Ethan said, which was technically true. "They sent a get well package." "That's nice." Mia cuddled the bear close, then sniffed the air. "Is that real soup? Not from a can." "Real soup. And there's enough for both of us." They ate together on the couch, Mia wrapped in blankets, half watching cartoons while Ethan fielded emails on his laptop. It was a strange kind of peace, this enforced domesticity, and he found himself grateful for it even as he worried about the work piling up in his absence. His phone rang around 2. Richard's name on the screen. "How's the patient?" Richard asked when Ethan answered. "Much better. I think she'll be able to go back to school tomorrow." "Good. Glad to hear it. Listen, I'm calling because Ms. Hart wants to move up the timeline on the vendor consolidation project. She's proposing we present preliminary findings to the board next week instead of after the new year." Ethan's mind immediately started racing through what that would require, what analyses were complete versus in progress, what could be accelerated without compromising quality. That's aggressive. What's driving the change? The board chairman is pushing for faster ROI visibility. Politics, basically. Richard sighed. "I know the timing is terrible with you out, but can you at least review the current data and tell me if we're ready?" "I'll have an assessment to you by end of day," Ethan promised. After hanging up, he dove into the files on his laptop, pulling up spreadsheets and models while Mia dozed beside him. The work was complex but manageable, assuming the team could dedicate focused time to it. He built a quick project plan, identified the critical path items, and sent it to Richard with his recommendations. Then, because he apparently couldn't help himself, he copied Vivian on the email. Her response came an hour later, not to the group but directly to him. "This is exactly the clarity we needed. Thank you. Rest tomorrow. I need you sharp for what's coming." "I need you." The words shouldn't have landed with such impact. She meant professionally, obviously. She needed his analytical skills, his ability to see patterns, his contribution to the project. Nothing more. But Ethan read those 3 words over and over anyway, like a teenager with a crush, and hated himself a little for it. Thursday morning, he dropped a fully recovered Mia at school and headed to the office with the kind of dread usually reserved for root canals. He'd spent 3 days away, 3 days building up his resolve to treat Vivian Hart as nothing more than his executive leadership, and now he had to walk back into the building and prove he could maintain that distance. The project team meeting was scheduled for 10. Ethan arrived early, set up his laptop, and reviewed his notes one final time. The others filtered in gradually: Richard, Sharon, Patricia, and several analysts who'd been pulled in to support the accelerated timeline. Vivian arrived exactly at 10, dressed in a charcoal suit that made her look every inch the CEO, her hair pulled back severely, her expression all business. She didn't look at Ethan directly, didn't acknowledge him beyond a general "good morning" to the room, and he told himself the small stab of disappointment was ridiculous. "Let's begin," Vivian said, taking her seat at the head of the table. "I've reviewed Ethan's project plan, and I think it's solid. Richard, can you walk us through resource allocation?" The meeting proceeded with clinical efficiency. Richard outlined staffing, Patricia covered budget implications, Sharon addressed vendor communications. When it was Ethan's turn to present the data analysis, he stood and clicked through his slides with practiced calm, explaining trends and projections and risk factors without once letting his voice waver or his eyes linger on Vivian for longer than professionally appropriate. She asked sharp questions that pushed his thinking, challenged his assumptions, forced him to defend his conclusions with evidence rather than instinct. It was exactly how she treated everyone. No favoritism or special consideration, and Ethan should have felt relieved. Instead, he felt the loss of something he'd never actually had. The warmth from the terrace, the honesty from her email, the version of Vivian who admitted she thought about him too much. All of it had been carefully locked away behind the armor she wore so well. This was what she'd meant about distance. This was what it looked like in practice. Two people in the same room, working together seamlessly, maintaining perfect professionalism, while pretending the conversation on the terrace had never happened. The meeting ended just before noon. People gathered their things, making plans for lunch, discussing weekend activities. Ethan was packing his laptop when Vivian's voice cut through the chatter. "Ethan, a moment, please." The room emptied quickly, the way rooms always did when the CEO wanted a private conversation. Sharon shot him a concerned look on her way out, but Ethan just shook his head slightly. Whatever this was, he could handle it. The door clicked shut, leaving them alone. Vivian didn't speak immediately. She moved to the windows overlooking the harbor, her back to him, and Ethan waited, his heart doing that stupid racing thing again. "I owe you an apology," she said finally. "For what?" "For putting you in an impossible position, for admitting feelings I had no right to burden you with, for making you question whether your success here is based on merit or something else entirely." She turned to face him, and Ethan was shocked to see genuine distress in her expression. "I've been in leadership for 15 years, and I've never once let personal feelings compromise my professional judgment. But with you, I've been struggling." "Vivian, please let me finish." She took a breath. "The distance I asked for, it's necessary, but it's also been incredibly difficult to maintain. Seeing you in meetings, reading your emails, knowing you're just a few floors away, and completely off limits, it's harder than I anticipated." "It's hard for me too," Ethan admitted quietly. "I know, I can see it in the way you avoid looking at me during presentations, in how you copy Richard on emails you used to send directly to me, in the careful way you navigate every interaction." Her voice softened. "And I hate that I've done this to you, that I've made you uncomfortable in a job where you should feel valued and secure." "You haven't," Ethan said firmly. "Everything you said on the terrace was true. The risks are real, the complications are real. You're protecting both of us by maintaining boundaries." "But what if I don't want to?" The question burst out of her like she'd been holding it back for weeks. "What if I'm tired of always doing the right thing, the safe thing, the thing that protects the company but leaves me alone in every way that matters?" Ethan's breath caught. "What are you saying?" Vivian closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. "I'm saying that I need to know if this is just me. If I'm imagining a connection that doesn't exist, projecting feelings onto someone who sees me only as their boss. Because if that's the case, I can live with the distance. But if you feel even a fraction of what I feel, then we need to figure out how to navigate this properly instead of pretending it doesn't exist." The vulnerability in her voice undid every defense Ethan had constructed. He took a step toward her, then another, until they were close enough that he could see the fine tremor in her hands, the rapid pulse at her throat. "It's not just you," he said. "I think about you constantly. I look for excuses to walk past your office. I save your emails even when they're just one-word responses because I like seeing your name in my inbox." He laughed shakily. "I'm completely gone for you, Vivian. Have been since that morning in the car when you didn't judge me for falling apart, when you saw all my messy reality and still gave me a chance." Ethan. His name was barely a whisper. "But I also have a daughter who depends on me to make smart decisions, and a career that I can't afford to jeopardize, and enough self-awareness to know that workplace romances, especially ones with this kind of power dynamic, rarely end well." "I know," Vivian said. "All of that is true. All of it matters." She reached up and touched his face, her palm warm against his cheek. "But I'm 42 years old, and I've spent the last 20 years building an empire at the expense of everything else. I've been successful and respected and completely alone. And then you walked into my life by accident and reminded me what it feels like to actually connect with someone." Her thumb brushed across his cheekbone, and Ethan's entire world narrowed to that single point of contact. "What are we doing?" he asked hoarsely. "I don't know," Vivian admitted, "but I think we need to figure it out together instead of pretending we can just ignore it." Before Ethan could respond, before he could think through all the very rational reasons why this was a terrible idea, Vivian rose up on her toes and kissed him. The world stopped. Everything Ethan had been trying to suppress, every feeling he'd been pushing down and compartmentalizing and pretending didn't exist, all of it came flooding back in a rush that made his knees weak. He kissed her back like a man surfacing after being held underwater too long, his hands finding her waist, pulling her closer. Vivian made a small sound against his mouth, her fingers sliding into his hair, and Ethan lost whatever remaining grip he'd had on rational thought. She tasted like coffee and mint and possibility, and kissing her felt like the first truly honest thing he'd done since the gala. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Vivian rested her forehead against his chest. "We can't do this here," she said. "Not at the office. Not where anyone could walk in. I know, but I don't want to stop." She looked up at him, her gray eyes fierce. "I don't want to go back to pretending." "Neither do I." Ethan's mind was already racing ahead, trying to figure out logistics, trying to see a path forward that didn't end in disaster. "But we need rules, boundaries, ways to keep this separate from work." "Agreed." Vivian stepped back, straightening her suit, visibly pulling herself together. "No one at the office can know. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Your performance reviews need to go through Richard exclusively. Any promotions or opportunities need to be justified with documented evidence that would satisfy a skeptical third party." "I can live with that," Ethan said. "And we need to be careful with Mia," Vivian added. "I won't have her hurt if this doesn't work out. She's the priority, always." The fact that Vivian's first concern was protecting his daughter made Ethan's chest tight. "Thank you. Don't thank me for basic decency." She moved toward the door, then paused with her hand on the handle. "Meet me tonight. Not anywhere public, not anywhere we might be seen. I'll text you an address." "Okay." Vivian left without looking back, and Ethan stood alone in the conference room, feeling like he'd just jumped off a cliff without checking if there was water below. The rest of the day passed in a fog. Ethan went through the motions of work, responded to emails, attended a vendor call, but his mind was elsewhere. On Vivian's mouth against his, on the way she'd trembled when he touched her, on the impossible situation they were wading into with their eyes wide open. The address she texted him just after 5 was in the Seaport District, a neighborhood of new construction and waterfront views. Ethan recognized it as one of the luxury condo buildings that had sprung up over the last few years, all glass and steel and price tags that made his head spin. He arrived at 7 as instructed and took the elevator to the penthouse floor with his heart in his throat. The door to Unit 4201 was slightly ajar. Ethan pushed it open and stepped into a space that was somehow both stunning and impersonal, all clean lines and expensive furniture that looked like it came from a catalog rather than being chosen with care. Vivian stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, still in her work clothes but with her shoes kicked off, a glass of wine in her hand. She turned when she heard him enter, and the vulnerability in her expression took his breath away. "This is my place," she said unnecessarily. "I bought it 3 years ago. I've probably spent a total of 30 nights here because I'm always at the office." Ethan closed the door behind him and took in the space. Immaculate kitchen that looked unused. Living room with a couch that still had the tags tucked into the cushions. A view that cost more than most people's entire homes. "It's beautiful." "It's empty," Vivian corrected. "Like most of my life has been." She set down her wine glass and crossed to him. "I don't know how to do this, Ethan. Relationships, connection, letting someone in. I'm terrible at it. I'll probably mess it up 100 different ways." "That makes 2 of us," Ethan said. "I haven't dated anyone seriously since Mia's mother left." "I don't know how to balance being a father with being someone's partner. I'll probably mess it up 200 different ways. Then we'll mess it up together." Vivian took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "And we'll figure it out as we go, because the alternative is going back to pretending, and I can't do that anymore." "Neither can I." They stood there in her empty penthouse, holding hands like teenagers, and Ethan felt something shift into place. This was real. Complicated and risky and potentially disastrous, but real. Tell me about Mia, Vivian said, leading him to the couch. Really tell me. What's she like? So Ethan did. He talked about Mia's fierce independence, her love of books, the way she approached the world with such earnest intensity. He told Vivian about the hard years when it was just the two of them against everything, when he'd worked 3 jobs and still barely made rent, when Mia had learned too young how to be brave in the face of uncertainty. Vivian listened with complete attention, asking questions that showed she was genuinely interested, not just being polite. And when Ethan ran out of words, she started talking too. About growing up in a family that valued achievement over affection, about building hard industries from a struggling mid-sized company into the powerhouse it was today, about the loneliness that came with success when you had no one to share it with. I made choices, she said. I prioritized career over everything else, and I don't regret that. But I'm starting to wonder if maybe there's room for both, if maybe I don't have to sacrifice every personal connection to be successful. I think you're allowed to want both, Ethan said quietly. Are you sure about this? Vivian asked. Because once we really start, once people know, there's no going back. Your career will always have an asterisk next to it. People will always wonder if you earned your position or if you slept your way into it. Let them wonder, Ethan said. I know the truth. You know the truth. And I've got spreadsheets full of data to prove I'm good at my job, regardless of who I'm dating. Dating? Vivian tested the word. Is that what we're doing? I don't know what else to call it. Neither do I. She leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. This is terrifying. Yeah, Ethan agreed, but also kind of amazing. They stayed like that for a long time, just sitting together in her empty apartment, talking about nothing and everything, learning each other in ways that had nothing to do with work or power dynamics or professional hierarchies. And when Ethan finally left around 10 to relieve the babysitter, Vivian walked him to the door and kissed him goodbye with a tenderness that made his chest ache. Slow, she said against his mouth. We take this slow. We're careful. We protect what matters. Agreed. And Ethan, thank you for taking the chance on me. He cupped her face in his hands. Thank you for being worth the risk. The weeks that followed were an exercise in carefully managed compartmentalization. At work, Ethan and Vivian maintained scrupulous professional distance. They didn't meet privately, didn't exchange personal emails, gave each other no reason for anyone to suspect anything had changed. Richard handled all of Ethan's direct supervision, and when Vivian approved his performance bonus in December, it came with detailed documentation of his contributions that would have satisfied the most skeptical auditor. But outside the office, they built something entirely separate. Dinners at her place or quiet restaurants far from downtown. Long conversations that stretched past midnight. Slow exploration of what it meant to let someone in after years of keeping everyone at arm's length. Ethan told Mia he was seeing someone, and she'd reacted with 6-year-old pragmatism. Is she nice? Does she like kids? When can I meet her? She's very nice, and I think she'd like you a lot. But we're taking things slow right now, okay? Okay, Mia had agreed easily, then gone back to her homework. Vivian was more nervous about that potential meeting than Ethan had ever seen her about anything, including board presentations and shareholder calls. What if she hates me? What if I don't know how to talk to her? What if I mess it up and she tells you I'm not good enough? You're going to be fine, Ethan assured her. Just be yourself. Myself is a workaholic CEO with no experience relating to children. Yourself is also smart and kind and genuinely interested in people when you let yourself be. Mia will see that. But they put off the introduction anyway, both of them needing more time to be sure this was going somewhere permanent before involving the most important person in Ethan's life. The vendor consolidation project wrapped successfully in early January, coming in under budget and ahead of schedule. The board was thrilled. Richard was recognized for his leadership, and Ethan received a promotion to Director of Strategic Operations that came with a substantial raise and expanded responsibilities. You earned this, Vivian told him that night at her apartment after they'd celebrated with takeout and champagne. Every bit of it. Your work on that project saved the company millions and improved our operational efficiency across 17 facilities. I know, Ethan said, and meant it. The promotion felt clean, justified, completely separate from their personal relationship. And you're still sure about this? Vivian asked. About us? because it's only going to get more complicated as you advance. People will talk more, question more, assume more. Ethan pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her shampoo, feeling the solid warmth of her against him. I've never been more sure of anything except Mia. That's a good answer. She kissed him softly. I think maybe it's time. Time for what? Time for me to meet your daughter. Ethan's heart stuttered. Are you sure? Terrified but sure. Vivian smiled nervously. You've become a permanent part of my life, Ethan, and Mia is a permanent part of yours. It makes sense that we should all know each other. So the following Saturday, Ethan found himself straightening his apartment for the 10th time while Mia watched with amusement. Daddy, it's fine. Everything's clean. Stop worrying. I'm not worrying, Ethan lied. You're doing the thing with your hands where you keep wiping them on your pants, even though they're not dirty. Mia walked over and took his hands in hers. Is your girlfriend really that scary? She's not scary at all. I just want everything to go well. It will, Mia said with the absolute confidence of someone who'd never yet had the world fail to meet her expectations. Because you like her, and I trust you. The doorbell rang at exactly 2 o'clock. Ethan opened it to find Vivian standing there in jeans and a sweater, looking more nervous than he'd ever seen her in any professional context. She held a gift bag that appeared to be filled with books. Hi, she said. Hi, come in. Vivian stepped inside and her eyes immediately found Mia, who stood in the living room watching with frank curiosity. For a long moment, the two most important people in Ethan's life just looked at each other, sizing each other up. Then Mia smiled. You're really pretty. Daddy said you were pretty, but I thought maybe he was exaggerating because he likes you. Vivian laughed, genuinely surprised. Thank you, you're pretty too, and I brought you something. She held out the gift bag. Your dad mentioned you like to read. Mia took the bag and pulled out 3 hardcover books, her eyes going wide. These are from the series I've been waiting to get from the library. How did you know? I asked your dad for recommendations, Vivian said, kneeling down to Mia's level. And then I asked a very nice bookstore employee which ones in the series were the best. So if I got it wrong, it's her fault. Mia giggled. You got it right. These are perfect. Then with the abruptness that only children could pull off, she walked forward and hugged Vivian around the waist. Thank you. Ethan watched Vivian's face transform, watched her carefully constructed defenses crumble as she hugged Mia back, and felt something in his chest crack wide open. This woman who commanded boardrooms and managed billion-dollar companies, who'd built an empire through sheer will and intelligence, was being undone by a 6-year-old's uncomplicated acceptance. You're welcome, Vivian said, her voice rough. When Mia pulled back, there were tears in Vivian's eyes that she quickly blinked away. So, what do you usually do on Saturday afternoons? Sometimes we go to the park, or the library, or the science museum if Daddy's not too tired from work, Mia said. What do you like to do? Honestly, I usually work, but I'd like to try doing what you do instead. Okay, Mia grabbed Vivian's hand with easy confidence. Let's go to the park. There's a really good climbing structure, and Daddy's scared to go on the tall slide, but maybe you're not. Ethan followed them out, watching Mia chatter away while Vivian listened with genuine interest, asking questions and laughing at Mia's observations about the world. At the park, Vivian proved she wasn't scared of the tall slide, earning Mia's immediate and complete approval. As the afternoon wore on, Ethan saw them slowly relax around each other. Mia explained her elaborate fantasy games. Vivian admitted she'd never learned to swing properly as a child and let Mia teach her. They built an elaborate sandcastle together while Ethan watched from a bench, his heart so full it hurt. This was what he'd been missing. Not just romantic connection, but the sense of family, of belonging, of building something together that was more than just survival and responsibility. On the walk home, Mia slipped her hand into Vivian's without hesitation, and Ethan saw Vivian's expression transform into something like wonder. Later, after Mia had gone to bed clutching one of her new books, Vivian sat with Ethan on the couch and said, She's extraordinary. She is. And she likes me. She loves you, Ethan corrected. I could see it in her face. I've never been part of something like this, Vivian said quietly. A family, real connection. It's terrifying and wonderful, and I don't want to mess it up. You won't, Ethan promised, pulling her close. We'll figure it out together. And as winter gave way to early spring, that's exactly what they did. The careful balance they'd built held through February and into March, a delicate architecture of separate worlds that only intersected in the privacy of Vivian's apartment or quiet moments at Ethan's place after Mia had gone to bed. At work, they were consummate professionals. Outside of it, they were building something that felt increasingly permanent, increasingly real. Vivian had become a regular presence in their lives, showing up for Saturday morning pancakes, helping Mia with her increasingly complex homework, learning the rhythms of their small family with the same focused attention she brought to everything else. She'd never been around children before, had no template for how to relate to a 6-year-old, but Mia made it easy with her uncomplicated affection and endless patience. I think she likes you better than me, Ethan joked one evening, after Vivian had spent 20 minutes explaining fractions using M and Emmas while Mia hung on her every word. Impossible, Vivian said, but she looked pleased. Though I did bring candy, which is clearly cheating. Strategic resource allocation, Ethan corrected, kissing her temple. You're just applying your CEO skills to parenting. But as spring arrived and the Hart Industries' fiscal year drew to a close, the questions started. Small things at first, easily dismissed. Sharon mentioning that Vivian seemed happier lately, more present, asking if Ethan knew why. Richard commenting that the CEO had been taking more personal time, wondering aloud if she was seeing someone. Patricia noting during a budget meeting that Vivian had smiled at something Ethan said, then quickly composed herself. Nothing concrete, nothing actionable. But the observations were there, accumulating like clouds before a storm. We need to tell people, Ethan said one night in late March, lying beside Vivian in her bed, the city lights casting patterns across the ceiling, before they figure it out on their own and construct a narrative we can't control. Vivian was quiet for a long time, her fingers tracing absent patterns on his chest. I know, she finally said. I've been avoiding it because once we make it public, everything changes. The questions, the scrutiny, the inevitable assumption that every professional decision I make regarding you is compromised. Your decisions aren't compromised, Ethan said firmly. Richard handles my reviews. Patricia approved my promotion. Everything has been documented and justified. I know that. You know that. But people will still talk. She rolled onto her side to face him. And I need to make sure you're truly prepared for what that means. The whispers in hallways, the speculation about whether you're qualified or just sleeping with the boss, the way some people will never take you seriously again. I can handle it, Ethan said. What I can't handle is continuing to hide something this important. Mia's already asking why you don't come to her school events, why we can't all go to dinner somewhere nice instead of always eating at home. That got Vivian's attention. What did you tell her? That we're being private right now, but that might change soon. Ethan took her hand, lacing their fingers together. She understands more than we give her credit for, and she deserves to have her family acknowledged, not hidden away like we're ashamed of it. I'm not ashamed, Vivian said quickly. I know, but from the outside it looks that way. And eventually someone's going to see us together somewhere, or notice the way you look at me when you think no one's watching, and the story will get out anyway. At least if we control the narrative, we can frame it on our terms. Vivian closed her eyes. You're right. I hate that you're right, but you are. She opened them again, and Ethan saw determination there alongside the fear. Okay, we tell people, but we do it strategically. HR first, to document the relationship officially and ensure there's a record of our disclosure. Then Richard and the senior leadership team. Then a company-wide announcement that's brief and professional and makes it clear this doesn't change anything about how business will be conducted. When? Ethan asked. After the Q1 earnings call next week, once we've successfully closed out the quarter and the board is happy. She pulled him closer. I want there to be no question that your work delivered results before anyone knew about us. No ammunition for people who want to diminish your achievements. The earnings call went exceptionally well. Hart Industries exceeded projections across all divisions, and the operational efficiencies Ethan's team had implemented were specifically cited by the CFO as major contributors to their success. The board was thrilled, shareholders were happy, and Vivian fielded praise from analysts who'd been skeptical about her aggressive expansion strategy. 2 days later, Ethan sat across from Barbara Chen, Hart Industries' Chief Human Resources Officer, in a conference room that suddenly felt too small. Vivian sat beside him, composed and professional, her hands folded on the table. "Thank you for meeting with us, Barbara," Vivian began. "We wanted to inform you officially that Ethan and I are in a personal relationship. It began in December, approximately 2 months after he was hired. We've been deliberately private about it to ensure there was no question about the appropriateness of his performance evaluations and career advancement." Barbara's expression remained neutral, though Ethan saw her eyebrows rise slightly. "I see. And you're disclosing now because—" "Because we're ready to be public about it," Vivian said, "and because we want to ensure everything is documented properly. Ethan reports to Richard Chen, not to me directly. His performance reviews, compensation decisions, and promotion to director were all handled by Richard and Patricia with documented justification. I've recused myself from any decisions that would create a conflict of interest." Barbara made notes on her tablet. "Have you reviewed our relationship disclosure policy?" "Yes," Ethan said. "We're in compliance with all requirements. We're not in a direct reporting relationship. We disclosed within 60 days of the relationship becoming serious, and we've maintained appropriate professional boundaries in the workplace." "The policy is designed for peer relationships," Barbara said carefully. "Not situations where one party is the CEO and the other is a director-level employee. That's a significant power dynamic." "We're aware," Vivian said, "which is why we've been so careful about documentation and avoiding any appearance of favoritism. Ethan's success at this company is based entirely on his performance, and we have the data to prove it." Barbara studied them both for a long moment. "I'll be frank with you. This is going to generate talk. Questions about judgment, about professionalism, about whether Hart Industries' leadership is setting an appropriate tone." "I understand," Vivian said, "but my personal life shouldn't be subject to different standards than anyone else's, and Ethan shouldn't be penalized for dating someone he met through work. We're both adults. We've been transparent about the relationship, and we've taken every reasonable step to ensure it doesn't create conflicts of interest." "What about the perception issue?" Barbara asked. "Employees who might feel that dating the CEO is now a path to advancement? Then they're welcome to try," Vivian said dryly. "I promise I'm not in the habit of promoting people based on romantic interest. Ethan is the first person I've dated in 5 years, and he earned his position through exceptional work that's generated millions in value for this company." Barbara made more notes, then looked at Ethan. "How do you want to handle this publicly? Company announcement, casual acknowledgement, or somewhere in between?" "Brief professional announcement," Ethan said. "Something that acknowledges the relationship, reaffirms that all company policies have been followed, and makes it clear that business continues as usual. We're not asking for special treatment or accommodation, just transparency." "All right." Barbara set down her tablet. "I'll draft something for your review. But I want to be clear, if there are any complaints about favoritism, any suggestion that this relationship is creating an unfair work environment, we'll need to address them seriously. That might mean additional reporting structure changes or even reconsidering Ethan's role within the company." "Understood," Vivian said. After the meeting, Ethan and Vivian stood in the hallway outside HR, the weight of what they'd just set in motion settling over them. "Second thoughts?" Vivian asked quietly. "Not even a little," Ethan said. "You?" "Terrified, but certain." She glanced around to make sure they were alone, then quickly squeezed his hand. "Thank you for pushing me to do this, for not letting me hide forever." The announcement went out the next morning in a brief email from Barbara Chen to all staff. It was professional, factual, and deliberately unremarkable. Vivian Hart and Ethan Cole were in a personal relationship. All company policies had been followed. There were no conflicts of interest. Business would continue as usual. Ethan watched the email hit his inbox at 9 o'clock and waited for the fallout. It came in waves. First, the supportive messages from colleagues who were genuinely happy for them. Sharon sent a text that just said, "Finally!" followed by approximately 20 celebration emojis. Richard called to say he'd known for weeks and was glad they'd stopped hiding it. Then came the whispers. Ethan felt them when he walked through the office, saw the way conversations paused when he entered a room. Most people were professional about it, but he caught the occasional look, the raised eyebrow, the carefully neutral expression that said, "So that's how he got promoted so fast." The hardest moment came 3 days after the announcement, when Ethan overheard 2 analysts from the finance department talking in the break room. "I'm just saying it's convenient," one of them said. New guy shows up, somehow lands the biggest project of the year, gets promoted twice in 6 months, and oh look, he's sleeping with the CEO. But sure, it's all merit-based. That's not fair, the other one protested. Cole's work on the distribution network was solid. The savings are real. Were they? Or did Hart just approve whatever her boyfriend recommended? How do we know any of his analysis was actually vetted properly? Ethan stood outside the break room, frozen, his coffee forgotten in his hand. This was exactly what Vivian had warned him about. The doubt, the assumption, the way his every achievement would now be filtered through the lens of their relationship. He could walk away, pretend he hadn't heard. Or he could address it head on. Ethan pushed open this break room door. The two analysts looked up, startled, their faces flushing with embarrassment at being caught. His analysis was vetted, Ethan said calmly, by Richard Chen, Patricia Okonkwo, and a team of external consultants who had no idea I was dating anyone, let alone the CEO. The savings projections were conservative, and we've actually exceeded them by 17%. If you want to review the methodology, I'm happy to walk you through it. My door's always open. The analyst stammered apologies and excuses, but Ethan just nodded and left, his hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline. He'd have to get used to this, to defending his competence, to proving himself over and over, to accepting that some people would never believe he'd earned his position honestly. But when he got back to his desk, there was an email from Vivian waiting. Just 3 words. Proud of you. She'd been monitoring the security cameras, had seen the whole exchange. Ethan smiled despite himself and got back to work. April brought Mia's 7th birthday, and with it, a request that stopped Ethan in his tracks. Can Vivian come to my party? Mia asked one evening while they were addressing invitations to her classmates. Please? She's basically part of our family now, and she promised she'd teach me how to make real tiramisu. Ethan's chest tightened. A birthday party meant other parents, people from Mia's school who had no connection to Hart Industries, no reason to know or care about his professional life. It would be the first time Vivian appeared publicly as part of their family in a context that was purely personal. Of course she can come, Ethan said, if she wants to. She will, Mia said confidently. She told me birthdays are important and she wouldn't miss mine for anything. The party was held at a local park on a Saturday afternoon in mid-April, one of those perfect spring days when Boston remembered it was supposed to be beautiful. Ethan had invited Mia's entire first-grade class, plus a few neighbors, and the chaos of 20-some kids running around the playground was exhausting but joyful. Vivian arrived right on time, carrying an elaborately wrapped present and looking slightly nervous in jeans and a casual sweater that Ethan had never seen her wear before. You came, Mia shrieked, launching herself at Vivian with the enthusiasm only 7-year-olds could muster. Of course I came, Vivian said, hugging her back. I promised, didn't I? Several parents noticed the exchange and watched with curiosity as Mia dragged Vivian toward the playground equipment. Ethan saw the moment of recognition on one mother's face, the way she whispered something to the dad beside her, and braced himself for awkward questions. Instead, the woman approached with a friendly smile. You're Vivian Hart, aren't you? I read about your company's new sustainability initiative in the Globe. It's impressive work. Thank you, Vivian said, visibly relaxing. Are you one of Mia's classmates' parents? Yes, my daughter Sophie is in her class. They do reading group together. The woman glanced at Ethan. Mia talks about you both all the time. She's a wonderful kid. She really is, Vivian said, and the genuine warmth in her voice made Ethan fall a little more in love with her. The party progressed without incident. Vivian helped organize games, served cake, and charmed every parent there with the same focused attention she brought to board meetings. Ethan watched her kneel down to talk to a shy child who was sitting alone, saw the way the kid lit up under her attention, and realized she was going to be an extraordinary stepmother if they got that far. When had he started thinking in terms of stepmothers and permanent futures? When had this stopped being a relationship he was carefully managing and started being the foundation of the life he wanted to build? As the sun started to set and parents collected their sugar-crashed children, Mia came over to where Ethan and Vivian were cleaning up wrapping paper and deflated balloons. This was the best birthday ever, she announced, then hugged them both simultaneously. Thank you for being my family. Over Mia's head, Ethan met Vivian's eyes and saw tears there that matched his own. They'd built this. Despite all the complications and risks and very rational reasons to keep their distance, they'd built something worth protecting. "Thank you for including me," Vivian said, her voice rough with emotion. Later that night, after Mia had crashed hard from cake and excitement, Ethan and Vivian sat on his apartment's small balcony watching the lights come on across the city. "I've been thinking about the future," Vivian said quietly. "About what it looks like if this keeps going the way it's going." Ethan's heart rate picked up. And I want you to know that I'm in this. Completely. Not just casually dating until it gets complicated, but actually building a life together." She turned to face him. "I know it's only been a few months since we went public, and maybe it's too soon to be having this conversation, but I've never been good at halfway measures." "It's not too soon," Ethan said. "I've been thinking about it too. About what it means to merge our lives more completely instead of keeping them separate." "I want to be part of Mia's life in a real way," Vivian continued. "Not just weekends and birthdays, but school pickups and homework help and being there when she's sick. I want to be someone she can count on, not just her dad's girlfriend who shows up sometimes." "She already counts on you," Ethan said. "She asked me last week if you were going to move in with us." Vivian's eyes went wide. "What did you tell her?" "That it was something we'd talk about when we were ready." He took her hand. "Are we ready?" "Your apartment is barely big enough for 2 people, let alone 3, Vivian pointed out. "True. And your place, while beautiful, feels like a hotel. All that open space and expensive furniture, but no personality, no warmth." "Are you suggesting we find somewhere new?" Vivian asked. "Somewhere that's ours instead of mine or yours?" "Maybe. Or maybe we take time to figure out what we actually want. What kind of space would work for all 3 of us? What neighborhood makes sense? How to blend our lives without losing the things that make each of us who we are." Vivian was quiet for a moment, processing. "I've never done this before. Never planned a future with someone, never thought about shared spaces and merged lives. It's terrifying." "But," Ethan prompted, hearing the unspoken word. "But I want to try. With you, with Mia, with all the messy, complicated reality that comes with building a family." She squeezed his hand. "I spent 20 years building a company and telling myself it was enough. And it's not. This is what enough feels like." Ethan pulled her close, breathed in the scent of her hair, felt the solid warmth of her against him. "We'll figure it out," he promised. "Together." The summer brought changes that felt both gradual and seismic. Ethan took on expanded responsibilities at Hart Industries, leading a new division focused on predictive analytics and operational optimization. The promotion came with documentation so thorough that even the most skeptical observer couldn't question it, and Ethan threw himself into the work with renewed energy. Vivian made good on her promise to be more present in Mia's life, rearranging her schedule to attend school events and doctor's appointments, learning to braid hair through YouTube tutorials and practice sessions that left them all laughing. She was awkward at first, uncertain of her role and terrified of overstepping, but Mia's uncomplicated acceptance made it easier. They started looking at houses in late June, wanting more space than either of their current places offered. Ethan had worried about the financial aspect, about contributing equally when Vivian's resources so vastly exceeded his own, but she'd shut down that conversation quickly. "This isn't about equal financial contribution," she'd said firmly. "It's about building a home together. You bring Mia, you bring warmth and perspective, and the ability to actually make a space feel lived in instead of like a furniture showroom. That's worth more than any down payment." They found a place in August, a 3-bedroom house in Cambridge with a yard big enough for Mia to play in and a kitchen that actually looked used. It needed work, but that felt appropriate somehow. They could make it theirs together, could build something from the foundation up. The week before they moved in, Ethan sat Mia down for a serious conversation. "You know Vivian is going to be living with us now," he said. "That means she'll be here every day, not just visiting. And that means she's going to have opinions about things like bedtime and homework and how much candy is appropriate." "I know," Mia said, swinging her legs from where she sat on the kitchen counter. "She already has opinions about those things. She just doesn't say them because she's trying to be polite." Ethan laughed, surprised. "You're very observant." "I told you that already." Mia tilted her head, studying him. "Are you worried I'm going to be upset?" Maybe a little. Well, don't be. Vivian's good. She makes you happy. And she makes really good pancakes. And she doesn't talk to me like I'm a baby. Mia's expression turned serious. Plus, she loves us. I can tell. How can you tell? Ethan asked, curious about what his 7-year-old daughter saw that he might have missed. Because she looks at you the way you look at me when you think I'm asleep, Mia said simply. Like we're the most important things in the whole world. Ethan felt his throat tighten. When did you get so wise? I've always been wise. You just don't always notice. Moving day arrived with perfect September weather, and between Ethan, Vivian, and a small army of professional movers, they had everything settled within a weekend. The house slowly transformed from empty space into a home, Mia's artwork covering the refrigerator, Vivian's books filling the shelves, Ethan's careful organization bringing order to the chaos. That first night in the new house, they sat together on the back porch, while Mia chased fireflies in the yard. Vivian leaned against Ethan's shoulder, both of them exhausted but content. I can't believe this is real, Vivian said quietly. 6 months ago, I was alone in that sterile apartment, working 80-hour weeks and telling myself it was fulfilling. Now I'm here, in a house that actually feels like a home, with a family I never expected to have. No second thoughts? Ethan asked. Not even one. She turned to kiss him softly. Thank you for being patient with me, for pushing me when I needed it and giving me space when I asked for it, for seeing past the CEO armor to the person underneath. Thank you for taking a chance on the guy who accidentally hijacked your car, Ethan said, for seeing potential instead of just problems. They watched Mia dart across the lawn, her laughter bright in the gathering dusk, and Ethan felt something settle into place. This was what he'd been fighting for all those years when it was just him and Mia against the world. Not just financial stability or professional success, but this sense of completeness, of family, of building something worth protecting. October arrived with familiar weather, the kind of crisp autumn morning that reminded Ethan of standing on a Boston street corner a year ago, soaking wet and desperate, climbing into a black car that would change his entire life. He'd been thinking about that morning a lot lately, about the strange confluence of circumstances that had brought him to Vivian. A canceled rideshare, a rainstorm, a moment of mistaken identity that had somehow evolved into the most important relationship of his life. On October 15th, exactly 1 year from that morning, Ethan woke early and slipped out of bed without waking Vivian. He had a plan, something he'd been working on for weeks, and he needed to set it in motion before she realized what he was doing. The package arrived at 9, and Ethan hid it in his home office before Vivian came downstairs. She was heading into the office for a board meeting, and he'd arranged to work from home, supposedly to handle a vendor call that required privacy. You're sure you're okay handling Mia's pickup today? Vivian asked, adjusting her suit jacket. Positive. You focus on impressing the board. She kissed him goodbye, ruffled Mia's hair on her way past the breakfast table, and headed out. Ethan waited until her car pulled away before retrieving the package and setting his plan in motion. That evening, he told Vivian he needed to show her something at the office, a new analysis he'd been working on that required her input. She agreed easily, trusting him completely, and they drove downtown together while Mia stayed with a neighbor who'd been thrilled to help with what Ethan had described as a surprise for Vivian. They rode the elevator up to the Hart Industries executive floor, which was deserted this late in the evening, and Ethan led Vivian toward the rooftop access that he'd gotten special permission to use. Where are we going? Vivian asked, amused but curious. You'll see. The rooftop was one of the building's best-kept secrets, a space usually reserved for maintenance access but offering stunning views of the Boston Harbor. Ethan had spent the afternoon transforming it, stringing lights across the railing, setting up a small table with wine and the good takeout from Vivian's favorite restaurant. Ethan, Vivian breathed, taking in the scene. What is this? It's October 15th, he said. 1 year exactly since I made the best mistake of my life. Understanding dawned on her face. The car, he confirmed. I've been thinking about that morning a lot, about how desperate I was, how scared, how certain I was that my life was falling apart, and how you could have sent me away, could have been angry or dismissive, but instead you listened. You saw me struggling and you gave me a chance anyway. Ethan, you earned that job, Vivian protested. I didn't give you anything you didn't deserve. I know, but you saw potential when I couldn't see it myself. You looked past the panic and the wetsuit and the obvious desperation, and you decided I was worth taking a chance on. He pulled out the package he'd been hiding all day, which is why I wanted to give you this. Vivian opened the wrapping carefully, revealing a framed photograph that made her gasp. It was the black sedan, her car, photographed on a rainy morning with the Boston skyline in the background. Below it was a small plaque with an inscription, October 15th, the day everything changed. Thank you for the ride. How did you... Vivian's voice broke. I tracked down the exact location where you picked me up, hired a photographer to capture it on a rainy morning, and had it framed. Ethan took her hands. Because that moment, that completely accidental moment, led to everything good in my life right now. My career, yes, but more importantly, you, us, this family we're building. Vivian was crying now, not bothering to hide it. I love you so much. I love you too. Ethan pulled her close, holding her while the city lights sparkled below them and the October wind carried the scent of rain that might come later. Thank you for seeing me, for believing in me, for building this life with me even when it was complicated and scary. Thank you for being worth the risk, Vivian said against his chest, for pushing me to want more than just professional success, for showing me what family actually feels like. They stood there for a long time, holding each other on the rooftop where they'd first chosen honesty over fear, where they'd admitted feelings that couldn't be ignored. The city spread out around them, full of possibility and promise, and Ethan felt the weight of the last year settle over him like a blessing. He'd come so far from that desperate man in the rain. He had a career that challenged and fulfilled him, work that made a real difference, respect earned through merit that no one could diminish. He had Maya, thriving in her new school, confident and loved and secure in ways he'd once only hoped for. And he had Vivian, brilliant and fierce and vulnerable in ways she only showed to him, building a future together, one careful decision at a time. Come on, Vivian said eventually, pulling back to wipe her eyes. We should get home. Mia made me promise we'd have hot chocolate before bed, and I'm not breaking that promise. They packed up the rooftop dinner and headed back down, the framed photograph carefully tucked under Vivian's arm. In the car, she reached over and took Ethan's hand, and he thought about how different this drive was from that first one, when he'd been a stranger pouring out his fears to someone he thought was a rideshare driver. Now she was his partner, his family, the person who knew all his fears and loved him anyway. And he was no longer the desperate single father barely keeping his head above water, but someone who'd built a life worth celebrating. The house was warm when they arrived, lights glowing in the windows, and Mia met them at the door with hot chocolate already prepared and a knowing smile on her face. Did you like your surprise? She asked Vivian. You knew about this? Vivian asked, laughing. Daddy told me everything. I helped pick out the frame. Mia handed them each a mug. So did it work? Are you happy? So happy, Vivian said, pulling Mia into a hug. Thank you for sharing your dad with me. You're welcome, Chen, Mia said seriously. But really, you're sharing me with him. I'm the important one. They settled on the couch together, the three of them, with their hot chocolate and the framed photograph now hanging on the wall where they could see it every day. Outside, the October evening deepened into night, and the first drops of rain began to fall, drumming against the windows in a rhythm that felt like memory, like promise, like everything coming full circle. Ethan looked at Mia curled against his side, at Vivian's head resting on his shoulder, at the home they'd built together, and felt a contentment so profound it almost hurt. This was what he'd been fighting for all those years. Not just survival, not just making it through one more day, but this sense of arrival, of belonging, of having built something worth protecting. A year ago, he'd climbed into the wrong car in a rainstorm and accidentally told his future to a woman he didn't know was listening. Today, that woman was his partner, his family. The foundation of a life he'd never dared to imagine was possible. Sometimes the best things in life started with mistakes, with moments of desperation and confusion and sheer dumb luck, with rain-soaked mornings and canceled rideshares and the courage to keep talking even when you had no idea who was listening. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, Those mistakes led you exactly where you needed to be. Ethan raised his mug in a quiet toast to the rain drumming against their windows, to October mornings and wrong cars and second chances, to the beautiful accident that had brought them all together. Vivian and Mia clinked their mugs against his, and in that moment, surrounded by warmth and love and the sound of rain, Ethan knew with absolute certainty that he was exactly where he belonged. The wrong car had led him home.